Hi, this is Mrs. Hernandez.
Hi, this is Mrs. Holland.
We're just, this is the next in our very, very fancy, very highbrow video tutorial series.
The ones you love so much.
I mean, they're going to miss it when it's gone, is all I can say. You
I
know,
feel like you're right. I feel like you're right.
I know.
Okay, if you're like, wait, I've seen this video. I've seen that meme. You are right.
Yep.
You most certainly have. But guess what? We have to redo it. Well, not redo it, but re-go over it first for your benefit. And second, because your second lit review has some tweaks and changes to it that the first video maybe didn't cover. And we all know that you guys were planning on going back to that first video and rewatching it in its entirety before doing lit review 2. We figured we'd just save you the time by giving you a new one. That
You're welcome.
You are.
So just as last time, your literature review needs to be 6 pages long, not including the works cited, but your works cited does need to be there. So again, not your annotated bib, but just a works cited. We've already worked on that. We've already peer reviewed that. So it should be easy for you to just put that there at the end. Your literature review should be guided by the approved research question that you submitted to Canvas and that your teacher approved. So don't veer from that without checking with your teacher first. Your literature review should give a comprehensive overview of the conversation regarding the above research question. That's why it's important that all of your sources kind of represent a gamut of ideas on this conversation, or they kind of run the spectrum of perspectives on your conversation. So hopefully all your sources are balanced, because that's not something we're checking until it's too late. The paper, it needs to be formal, written in formal academic style, which means no contractions, elevated word choice and syntax, and no references to yourself or your own opinion. You're totally removed and totally unbiased. It should be carefully formatted in MLA. It should be meticulous MLA formatting, as we've done before, which is a little bit more difficult because we're adding quotes in this time. So there's a little bit more MLA in there for you. And I know you think that you are exempt and some sort of exception to this, but every single person in CE, with no exceptions, needs to edit their paper multiple times through multiple lenses, meaning you're reading through your paper 8 separate times, with a separate purpose in mind each time. And that's how good writers produce great writing. And then, as always, your paper needs to be virtually free of errors in grammar, style, and formatting. And that's just everything we've gone over before. You're just kind of improving and elevating for this literature review.
And please remember comma rules for that, because we're certainly going to point those out when you are making comma errors. Think about some of the comma things we've gone over. Okay, so hooray, you've already compiled your works cited page, and you've already had it peer reviewed, and you've already done your edits to it, hopefully. And hopefully when you put this into your annotated bibliography, all of your citations are correct. Make sure when you do your works cited that they're in alphabetical. Make sure for your, I know this is lit review, but well, I guess let's just stick with lit review. So compile it, make sure it's in alphabetical order. Remember to be meticulous, make sure every comma, space, period, quote, URL is placed in the right spot. Use your little Wildcat handbook for this, because it shows you examples for every single thing. Make sure you're double spaced, you have your hanging indents. Remember guys, if you submit it in a PDF, you don't ever have to worry about your page formatting skewing at all. So good tip.
Alrighty, so here's the part where things are a little bit different from literature review number 1. You've got to create your own headings. So for literature review number 1, we gave you the 2 headings. Remember, Money Matters and More Than Money Matters. We gave you those headings, right? Because creating headings is a lot harder than it sounds, and we wanted to scaffold that learning for you. But now with your literature review, with your own topic, you are going to create your own headings. And the way that you do that is consider your topic, your research question, a big umbrella. And your headings both fall under that big umbrella, but they're just a different side of the umbrella under that umbrella overhang, right? So you should be able to separate and organize the main points of all of your sources into 2 or 3 bigger groups, supporting point groups, right? You can use 2 headings or 3 if you think that it really makes sense that your information can be separated into 3 distinct sections. So you decide on those sections and decide how each portions of each of your sources fall under each of those headings, right? So deciding on those subtopics means you have to decipher a supporting point from a main supporting point. That's important, right? So keep in mind, we're 2 or 3 large supporting points, and there might be many supporting points under each of those headings, under each of those subtopics. So learn how to organize the information in such a way that you can kind of do large as the whole conversation, medium would be headings, and small would be little supporting points within those headings.
Maybe
Right?
look at your organizers that you use for summaries. You listed 2 main points in every single one of those. Maybe look at those and try to find the connection between those main points.
Oh,
What
yeah.
is something that they're all maybe main point 1 you'll see in 4 or 5 of your sources, and you can be like, oh yeah, that works perfectly for a heading. Use those on your organizers to help you come up with headings.
Right. And so you should have 2 or 3 headings. You shouldn't have more than 3, and you certainly shouldn't have fewer than 2. That's for sure. So 2 to 3 headings, your decision. Either decision is fine as long as it's justified within your sources. Next, in each heading, remember for literature review number 1, you had to have all 6 sources under each heading. That's no longer the case. Because this is a more nuanced discussion, you decide what sources, the supporting points within each source fits under which heading. So you only need to have a minimum of 4 sources under each heading. You can have 5 or 6 under each heading, but minimum of 4. And then keep in mind that while you need 4 sources under each heading, all 6 sources have to be represented somewhere in the literature review. So if in heading number 1, you don't use source number 5, make sure the source number 5 is discussed in heading number 2. So make sure that all of your sources, right? Some sources will only be mentioned once in your literature review, and other sources could be mentioned 2 or 3 times. If you have one source that covers each heading topic, it might appear in each of your headings, but keep in mind, and remember this is super important, you only need to formally introduce your source 1 time. So whether that happens, whether it appears first in heading 1 or heading 2, just remember that you only need to formally introduce it 1 time for each source. And if you use it again in the literature review after that, you don't need to formally introduce it again. You're gonna tire yourself out if you try to formally introduce it every time.
Okay, so another new thing that you guys are doing for this lit review is that you're integrating quotes, direct quotes, and you should have a minimum of 6 direct quotes in your literature review. Not under each heading, but in the entire lit review. You should have at least 1 direct quote from each source. So make sure that each source is quoted 1 time. You can use more than 6 if you would like, but you really should stay within between maybe 6 and 9. Do not go over 9. One of the things that we want you to still practice is your summary and paraphrasing skills. You've learned that from Lit Review 1. You did a great job with Lit Review 1 without any quotes. So we want you to make sure that you are incorporating both paraphrasing and summarizing along with good impactful quotes. So for your citations.
Well, wait, one quick thing. The reason we're not letting you use more than 9 quotes is because some students start to rely too heavily on the quotes to explain their points, and they use the quotes instead of proper commentary and analysis about those quotes. So we're trying to steer you away from that. So you should be using in any paper a variety of direct quotes and paraphrasing, and kind of alternating those, not strictly, but use a variety of evidence types, basically. So your paper doesn't get too padded with quotes or too vague with paraphrasing. We got to find a lovely balance between both.
Absolutely. Yes. For your citation, make sure that you're using a parenthetical citation for your direct quotes. You should cite each quote, but also you guys, you should be citing paraphrases. We talked about at the end of your Lit Review 1, there were a couple moments in a few literature reviews where there was no citation given, where a citation was needed. So just be careful when you're doing paraphrasing and summarizing that you're not doing any type of accidental plagiarism. For your quotes, it's harder to do that with, right? Like after a quote, you all know that you need to have some type of in-text citation. So even though you'll have the 6 quotes, no more than 9, you certainly need far more than 6 in-text citations because you should be doing your paraphrased in-text citations. So remember, we've talked about incorporating quotes. Every single quote must be properly sandwiched. So remember, you need to have that context, intro, analysis for every single one. There's a video on Canvas. You have that yellow mustard colored handout for it.
It's salmon colored in my class.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, the salmon color.
I called it pink, and someone literally corrected me and said salmon. So now I say salmon with a snooty air, you know.
Make sure they're all properly punctuated. So you guys really, the quotation marks and the mechanics, where the comma goes, where the question marks go, things like that, students really tend to struggle with that. So use that little Wildcat handbook, any of the sources we've put on for you. You know, you can also Google things in MLA. Where does the comma go, right? Like use the internet if you need to. Make sure you're punctuating it correctly. Your MLA should be meticulous.
All righty. So now that you've decided on your headings, right? And by the way, each of your whole literature review should have its own unique title to title the entire thing, the big umbrella title. But then each of your headings should have a unique, insightful title that is most certainly not heading number 1, heading number 2. It needs to be unique, insightful, and kind of give me a mini thesis of your thesis. Is that confusing? So a summary of your thesis in 3 words. I know, right? But so just think, right? Just think your titles are what people are going to see first, and they have to be insightful and great. So now that you've decided what your headings are going to be, you need to organize your sources within that heading so the information flows appropriately. So making the order of your sources matters. The order in which you introduce and discuss your sources within that heading matters. Because, so for instance, this is just an example, if you introduce 3 sources that all kind of share the same idea about that heading, and you've introduced them all and contextualized, summarized them all, you have a quote from each of them, then you can kind of refer to those 3 sources in concert as you relate it to another opposing source. So the way that you introduce the order matters, and the order might save you some time and effort in discussing the connections. So spend some time thinking about how the sources within your headings should be ordered and organized.
Okay, so think of each heading as a mini lit review. Remember, we talked about that before, that each one of your headings really should be able to almost stand alone as its own little mini paper. So you should have a mini thesis to support your overall thesis and a mini introduction. So you should have your heading, a couple sentence introduction, discuss how each source compares and contrasts to other source, right? So you need to make sure that you're doing more than just saying like, this source agrees with this source, and then just go on to talk about the other source. Your connections need to really have that how they connect and not just whether or not they agree or disagree. You need to represent all sides of the mini conversation. So if make sure that your headings are still balanced. If you're going to have heading number 1 and you're only going to put 4 sources in that heading, you need to make sure that it represents the conversation. So just be careful, since you have 3 on one side and 3 on the other side, that when you are putting it into your little mini headings, that you're still creating some type of balance inside of those headings. And then you'll need that little mini wrap up. Remember, we don't call it a conclusion because it's not necessarily a so what, who cares, but just a wrap up of that particular heading. If you forgot to do this in Lit Review 1, you saw it impact your overall score on your rubric. So please don't forget to include that mini wrap up.
Alrighty, so now's where we get into the heading. So remember, I know it seems counterintuitive to write the middle of your paper before you write the beginning and the end. But if you write the middle of your paper before you write the beginning and the end, then you can ensure that the beginning is a perfect umbrella of what you've already written, if you've already written it, right? And that your conclusion then encompasses and extends your conclusions about the entire conversation. It just ensures that your introduction and conclusion pertain to exactly the thought process you went through for the body. So if you think you're going to write all of your headings first before you write your big introduction and your big conclusion last, right? But even within that heading, you can write it in reverse order as well. So within your heading, write the connections first, then write an introduction to your heading that encompasses what you're going to discuss with the connections, and write a little mini wrap up at the end that encapsulates the overall view of how those sources connect. So the reader can kind of get a good idea of the connections within the heading on a zoom out on the connections, basically. But think about this again. You're writing heading number 1, complete that, write it in reverse order, write the body of the heading, then the introduction and conclusion, then move on to heading number 2, follow the same process, write the body of the heading, that's your connections, the body of the heading, then write your introduction and conclusion for that heading. And you can have 3 headings, you don't have to have 3 headings. So if you decide to do a third one, that's fine. This whole colon thing, I'm just noticing it now is just terrible. But just bear with us, you know what I'm saying? You don't have to do a third heading, but if you do a third heading and you feel like your information is best organized in that way, then still write it in reverse order. I promise it'll make your product more cohesive.
Yeah, I feel like with the amount of writing that you guys have done in this class, that you should really realize that that is truly the best method when you're writing. Think of it as very similar. The writing process and like the research process seems to be like very closely related in that way. Think of like where you thought you were going to go with your research and where it sort of kind of started taking you as you did it. The same thing happens with your writing. You know what you have in your mind, you know what the sources are about, but it's not until you put that like pen to paper, or I guess like type it on your computer, that you like actually start to really know exactly what the entire conversation and how you can encompass all of it in an intro. Okay, and then you need to write your overall introduction. Remember to start with some type of attention-getting intro. I feel like students tried to do this in Lit Review 1. Try to find something that really hooks your reader. Try to get them interested in your topic. Make sure if you're using something that you found online that you're still appropriately using it in your Works Cited page if you need to. Remember, your reader is somebody who goes to Clearfield High, who's one of your friends, who's just in a different English class, who has no idea what this topic is. Well, actually, think of even just your fellow CE students who are all doing their own topic right now, and you have to assume that they don't know anything about this topic, and you need to hook them to make them interested when you're writing your topic.
And Therese, here's the thing, like, I think students tried to do this, but they weren't very successful. No offense, y'all, in Literature Review 1. I think it's really hard to remove yourself from what you already know about the topic and look through the eyes of somebody new to the topic. I think you guys really struggle with understanding the information that some person would need to know in order to follow you with your connections. So keep in mind, somebody who's never heard of this topic, what basic information would they need about the topic in order to then follow your connections into your heading, in your headings? So make sure, put yourself in the place of someone who doesn't know about this topic, and make sure your introduction is geared towards getting them up to speed before you get into the details.
And that's further than just like a topic sentence, where I had a lot of students say something like, the great debate in America has been about whether or not there's equity in schools, right? Like a lot of your readers don't even know what you mean by that. what do you mean by equity in schools, right? Think about when we first introduced that topic to you guys, how much understanding you had about it. So it's
Well,
not.
and it's funny, like even in the mini introductions in your headings, I told students, what if you said that you needed to, resources were important, your reader's not even gonna know what resources are. And so few students still took the time to be like, okay, well, resources means
Yes,
teachers, textbooks, technology, the actual building itself. Like you didn't take the time
yes.
to explain that. You really got to think about what your reader needs to know in order to come with you on your analysis.
Absolutely, absolutely. Make sure that you have a clear, concise thesis statement, something that is a mini overall, like what is this conversation about for that particular heading? What are all these authors addressing in this mini lit review in this heading? And then give a brief preview of your supporting points. I had a lot of students not do this in Lit Review 1. Try to think of like what's going to happen in the body. Think as now that you've done all this research that you've done and you've had to peruse and kind of skim through a bunch of different sources in order to know what you're looking for and to see if it's something that you wanted. Think of how often you did that in papers, where you just kind of looked at the intro, looked at the conclusion, looked through some of the headings. Those are important. They're so important. What are some of the main points in those headings? Your readers should be able to read your heading and that mini heading or the mini intro and think, this is not what I'm looking for, or this is what I'm looking for. It should be thorough enough that they can get the gist of what that heading is going to specifically be about.
All right, so once you're done with your introduction, a lot of students omitted the areas of further inquiry or were still confused about it or weren't quite sure what to say for it. So
Yes.
remember, your areas of further inquiry is that box on your summary organizer sheet. And all you're asking is, what did this author not cover within this conversation? Assuming that this is supposed to be each source is supposed to be a comprehensive overview of the conversation, what did they leave out? What communities or representation for different types of people or different types of situations, what did they leave out? What did they not consider? In what areas should more research be done in order to fully communicate the nuances of this conversation? So you can either make this a separate heading, areas of further inquiry, and make a title there, or you don't need to. It can be part of your conclusion. But either way, it should be a healthy part. It should be at least a good paragraph. So you can discuss the individual sources and what their areas of further inquiry were. And as a whole, all of your sources, what are they all missing? What, in light of all of them, zoom out, and in light of all 6 sources, what areas did all 6 sources not cover? Where could more research be done? And that's what you're doing, because essentially when you do research in the higher levels of college, your literature review is going to be the preamble for your research, and your areas of further inquiry is going to define, if you've looked at all the literature review on the topic, all the literature on the topic that you're researching, your areas of further inquiry is the meat of it, because you're saying further research needs to be done and I am going to do it, right? So your areas of further inquiry is meant to be, someone has looked at the research that everyone's already done on it, so they can do research that is necessary to complete the conversation. So imagine if you were a researcher and you were looking at everything that's been said on that topic because you want to be a voice in that conversation, and what missing parts of that conversation can you fill? That's what the area of further inquiry is.
I'm really confident in your guys' area for further inquiry this time, because you are the ones who have done the research this time. You are the ones who have seen multiple conversations. You're the ones who have looked through all of these different sources and thought, this doesn't work in my conversation. This does work in my conversation. So think back to all that research, all those sources that you looked through, ones that maybe you went, that's kind of interesting, but also that doesn't really fit in with this topic right now, right? Because you were pretty focused in this lit review. So I really think that you guys will do much better in this time. Okay, overall conclusion. I personally think that you guys are getting so much better at this.
Yep.
When I look at your boxes in the summary organizers, they're just you guys have really started to get the sense of explaining the importance of each one of these topics. So your conclusion needs to be very in-depth, very unbiased, very objective. Don't take a stance. Remember, maybe with the last lit review, you guys weren't, I mean, I know a lot of you really cared about that topic, but I mean, you chose your topic this time. This matters to you. You know it and we know it, and your readers should know that it matters to you, but not what side you take in it. Your conclusion, I guarantee you, is going to be more difficult in the sense that you are going to really need to keep an objective stance on this.
I shouldn't be able to tell what your opinion is from this literature.
Absolutely. When I get to the end, I shouldn't know whether or not you're for or against physician-assisted suicide. I should just know that you know what the conversation is now and what both sides are equally saying. So make sure that you stick with that. It's going to be a little harder this time. So really, really pay attention to that bias in your conclusion. Make sure to summarize, but not just reiterate all the stuff from before. You don't want to go word for word talking about, you know, making your conclusion far too long about just summarizing. Make sure, same with your thesis, that you're including those, but you're not just going back and just restating all the things you've already stated in your paper. We're beyond that when it comes to conclusions, right? Think about that. So what, who cares? Who's directly affected? Why should they care about the topic? So one of the things that I want you to remember for the so what, who cares, they kind of work together. So what are like, or who cares? Think about who cares. And the so what is how those people who care are directly impacted by these things. Think of the big picture of how it's significantly impacting our society, right? Like we understand that there's a lot of people who care about physician-assisted suicide, right? But if I'm not somebody who fits into those boxes of who cares and how it affects them, then you might have lost me as a reader, right? But what you need to do is say that in addition to these people and how it directly impacts them, here's how it will eventually impact you as the reader. So that's what we're looking for. That's kind of how you can separate that so what and big picture. I have students who kind of mesh those together. And be specific in it. Remember, this is US society, this is American society. If you went global and you're going to talk about this is how it can impact the world, right? Because a lot of you went global. So make sure that I know particularly who this is affecting. Remember that mic drop ending, pull in that big picture. At the end, everyone is going to care. Think about your presentation. When you give this presentation after your lit review, you want every student in our class to go, wow, I did not really think this was that big of an issue. I didn't know that much about it, but now I understand this is a problem. I should care and I should, you know, be aware of the situation and be a part of changing it and making sure that that big picture implication doesn't happen. So just to make sure that you have that moment that if you think about, if you read this conclusion at the end of a presentation, if the students in the class went, yeah, cool, then you haven't done that wrap up. How does everybody feel impacted by it?
And the other good question to ask yourself for this big picture, right, is you have to go outside of the world of your topic. So a bad big picture for the education topic would be repeating the so what. So big picture, if education is not going to be fair if we don't fix it. That's not a big picture. That's a so what. That's why should we care?
Yes.
But a big picture is tell me then outside of the world of education or outside of the medical community, outside of the, you know, I can't think of another example, you know, gun community or whatever, outside of that specific community with that conversation, blow it up like a balloon. And how does it, what kind of society as a whole are we going to have if this issue gets fixed or is addressed? And what kind of society are we going to have if it doesn't get addressed? I'm talking big picture outside of the conversation of your topic. And a lot of students have a hard time blowing it up. But for instance, in the education topic, what kind of society could we possibly have if every member of our society was educated equally, regardless of the color of their skin and how much money their parents make? What kind of learners, voters, parents, leaders would we have? So that's outside of the world of education. We got to talk about what could we be and what might we be if we don't fix it.
Yeah, and this will pull in your bias so much with the big picture. If you're saying that this is going to impact society if we, if we don't take away, I'm just going with guns since that's what you just talked about, and it's an off-limit topic anyway. But if somebody was just to say, if we do not remove guns or create strict, more strict restrictions on guns and who can own them and how they can get them, then society is going to become this. If that's all your big picture is, you are clearly stating your bias. What you need to therefore say too is that if guns remain to have, really loose restrictions and this happens, then this is also the type of society that we can have. So you need to make sure, because both sides are going to have a different big picture implication, and you should be representing both sides in your conclusion. So this is one of those areas, be careful, don't be biased in your big picture.
Yup. And so we have an outline that's very similar to the outline that was given to you for Literature Review 1, but there are so many students who do not reference this outline again, and it drives me a little bit batty, because if you were just to have the outline next to you and follow it as you're writing, a lot of those rubric scores would be great. Like, I mean, honestly, it's so frustrating. So keep in mind, this is just an overview of what the introduction should have, what each heading should have, what the conclusion should have, and all kind of the do's and don'ts within that. So please take a look at the outline.
Okay, so make sure that you formally introduce all of your sources in text the first time that it's mentioned. Make sure that your connections, if you're connecting it to a source that hasn't been mentioned yet, that you're formally introducing it. The title of the text, you only need to put this in once, especially think of how long sometimes the title of your sources are with their colon and then their other big giant thing. Just introduce it once the first time you introduce the text. Make sure that you have it either in quotations or italics. I know students are using books, so be sure that your books are in italics. And you're following that MLA capitalization. Your work cited peer review that we just did should have caught that. So make sure that however you have it in your work cited, if you have done your revisions to it, it also needs to look like that in text. Use the full name for the author and then last name. Remember, we're not their friends. We don't know them. So just continue calling them by their last name. And don't include the outlet of your source or the credentials of the author in text unless it's especially necessary. I saw that somebody had a source where it was, I think it was from the New York Times, and I think it was written by a former police officer who is Black and is a part of this Black Lives Matter conversation. Maybe those credentials might possibly, I'm not saying that they do, but they might contribute. Unless they do though, you don't need to include that in there like you did your annotated bibliography.
Well, and that's the thing. So if you're writing a paper with an annotated bibliography, you don't need to discuss credibility really, because you've already established credibility of each author in your annotated bib that's ideally attached to whatever paper you're doing. So if you've done an annotated bibliography, you don't need to count to include the credentials much, but unless it's pertinent. But if you weren't including an annotated bib and you were doing a research paper, please remember that the credibility of the author matters if you haven't already established it within the annotated bib.
Absolutely. You're certainly going to get professors in college who are going to require credibility of outlet and author if they're not attaching some type of annotated bib to it, for sure.
And so this rubric is very similar to the Literature Review 1 rubric with a few additions. So there's a quote section that quotes from each source, 6 or more, are masterfully selected, effectively used to support the thesis, and include thorough context and elaboration for each. That just means that they're appropriately sandwiched in a quote sandwich. Then next, the other addition is that there needs to be a unique and insightful title for the overall paper and for each heading, 2 periods, because I really mean it. Um,
The end.
but otherwise, everything is pretty much the same as the previous rubric. So at least you'll kind of feel like you know how you'll be graded on this. Oh, also, there's an addition on the conventions section that talks about punctuation in and around each quotation, and the corresponding citation is correct. So pay special attention anytime a source title or a quotation comes into play. That's when y'all get real sticky with that punctuation. Oof.
Oh, the editing lenses. You guys, I know that we can tell who self-edits and who does not. It is so obvious. And yes, I know it feels like we're asking you to do like a massive thing by rereading your paper over and over again. But really, it's so useful. Think of, I'm going to read this once and I'm going to look through the lens. I'm going to look at the outline. Does it follow that PDF? You guys think of, I really did. I had students who probably could have been in the 90s, but they were in the 80s because they didn't have a wrap up or a mini intro. That's a big deal. If you look at that PDF and you follow that outline, just go through it and just check it off. Think about, do I have all this information? Make sure that it's organized. For Lit Review 1, I had students who followed a very clear structure that within a couple paragraphs, I understood the structure of their paper. They were doing this and then doing this and then doing this and then repeating. Some students, though, it just felt very much like, oh, and then this person connects with this person who then connects with this person. And it just got so unorganized and you lose your readers through that. So look at your organization. If you can't tell me how you organized your paper, then it's not organized. You should know what method and structure you followed, which there's not a right way. You just need to make sure it's organized. Look through it with MLA citation errors, double check your works cited page, and then read through the rubric. You guys know these rubrics very, very well, especially through peer review. So you should be very familiar with the rubric and to know exactly what expectations we're looking for and how you get that mastery score for each section. So make sure you look through that, read your paper with that lens. Read the introduction and then read the rubric and look at the mastery and see if yours fits in that box.
So with these lenses here, think about them as each of these 8 different ways. You're looking at your paper 8 separate times, but with a different shade of glasses on. And each pair of glasses means you're focused on each one of these separate writing components. And again, good writers look through different lenses and make sure their work checks out on a lot of different levels. So we're talking about the artistry of your writing style, the mechanics of your writing formatting and syntax, and the organization of it. There's tons of different elements that come into play with the writing, and you have to look at each of those elements separately in order to ensure that they're all what they need to be. So again, lens number 5 is those distracting errors. Those are the mechanical errors. Vague pronouns and vague language, and awkward structure of sentences, awkward word choices. So read through that there's no errors, basic errors. And remember, Weaver State wants you to ensure that there's virtually no errors. So lens number 8 is have someone else you trust read over your paper through the above lenses. Have somebody you trust, and I'm talking about a parent. Don't go sharing your PDF, friends. I'm talking about a parent, somebody, if you're in CE, chances are your parents are a smarty. So ask them to look through it. Tell them the different lenses that you're editing your paper for, and ask them to look through those 8 lenses as well at your paper, because it's so hard to see your own mistakes because you know what you meant. Again, clear and concise. If you learn anything this year,
Yes.
how to deal with sources, how to appropriately, responsibly, and ethically deal with sources. That's number 1. And number 2 is clear and concise writing. If you only remember 2 things, those 2 things are what you should remember. Your writing should be beautifully clear and concise now. If you have unnecessarily wordy sentences, or if you can improve your sentence structure with the use of a colon, a semicolon, or dashes, punctuation that you might not be as familiar with, look for clear and concise. There's ways to say exactly what you mean in as few words as possible, and that's what a good writer is. at least for informational writing. We're
Yes.
not F. Scott Fitzgerald.
No, we're
Okay, no. And then formality, keep in mind, when you say our society, you're making a formality violation. It's not our society. Define what society it is and pretend you're totally removed from it. So instead of our society, it should be American society. If you feel like saying we should fix this, you should say American citizens. You know, remove yourself completely. And of course, no I, my opinion, me, my, and don't refer to the reader. You should care about this. Don't do that, right? You're not going to refer to the reader. You're not going to refer to yourself, and you're not going to refer to yourself and the reader in conjunction with each other. And again, have somebody you trust look over it. But please, for the love of all that is holy, you guys, don't be sharing full papers with friends, because people get desperate and they might steal your stuff. It's rough.
Don't
So
use it.
Please, just don't use it. Don't steal and don't share.
For these lenses for 5, 6, and 7, you guys, one of the biggest tips when it comes to these particular lenses is to read your paper out loud.
Yeah.
I know that it takes longer to do that, but when you're scanning through your paper, it's so easy to miss I and me and us. But when you're reading your paper out loud, man, the second you hear we, you're like, ah, that doesn't belong there.
We should add that in as one of these lenses, because honestly, nothing is going to help you more than hearing your paper read out loud. For the love of all that is holy, no one is too good for that. Don't think that you're the exception to that rule. Read it out loud.
Have one of your, when you're doing the fresh eyes, have somebody read the paper out loud while you listen, because you will hear those awkward sentences, because you'll hear your readers stumble on those sentences, or you'll hear your readers have to start over on those sentences. You're clear and concise. When you hear somebody just being like, you know, preposition after preposition, you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, I gotta fix that sentence. You guys, there is power to reading things out loud through an editing lens. Do it at least once. Either you do it or have somebody else do it. Listen to it being read.
Seriously though, you are not exempt from this. You, yes, you, no, you, actually you. I'm talking to you. All righty, guys. Please don't leave this to the last minute. We can tell if you wrote it all in one night, because you get fatigued at about page 2 and stuff gets lazy.
Yes, I had a lot of really, really great heading 1s.
Yep.
And then some really small rushed heading 2s, because you were just done and you ran out of time and you submitted it. And your heading 1, you were meticulous, you were slower with, you took your time with. Please pace yourself. Pace yourself.
In any college class, in any assignment that's a substantial size, you should be working backwards from the due date and figuring out chunks of the assignment that you complete each day leading up to the due date, so you can come to each chunk of that assignment fresh and ready to write, and then leave it for a bit. It's healthy to leave it for a bit, but if you're leaving stuff, don't leave it till the last minute. Oh, I'm so funny.
I liked this. You know, we believe in you, and you know you believe in you this time around too. I feel like Lit Review 1, you were like, I don't know about this. 6 whole pages. And now you guys are like, oh, I'm totally capable of this.
But
and
the thing is,
this time too, this is a cool topic for you. You chose something you care about. Show it in your writing. Show that you understand this topic.
But that's the thing, you're not going to be fully aware of how much you've learned in this class, because you've been so concentrating on turning in all of these assignments, so many of them, that you're not really realizing how much you've learned until you sit down to write literature review number 2 and realize just how far you've come. Go back and read summary number 1. Those were bad, but you've come so far, and you use this literature review as a chance to, I know this sounds cheesy, but congratulate yourself. You've come very far in only a few months. And what you've learned in this class, you're going to apply to every single time you write for the rest of your life. So Absolutely. It matters, and congratulate yourself, because you've all progressed so much.
And also don't forget that it's 30% of your grade.
It's such a big fat part of your grade. Don't turn it in late, y'all, because that late penalty is going to be hefty on 30% of your grade.
Yeah. Oh, 3%. And on top of that too, remember, if your peer review is not complete and ready to go, you forfeit your chance for revision. So make sure that your peer review for this is on point. It's complete. You're ready. You want the best. what's the word I'm looking for? Like feedback. You want the best feedback, and you're not going to get it if you're not giving a complete product. So make sure you have that, have it in, do your peer review. You'll get it in on time, and you'll have the opportunity to revise if you need.
Lovely. You guys are going to be great. We believe in you.
We do.
Okay, bye.
Bye.